ought to be in pictures. You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures. Oh, what a hit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Deep Dive Movie Reviews with my friend Steve Hackman and myself, James Marsh. And welcome to episode 2 of Every Best Picture. This episode, we are discussing 1929's Best Picture winner. I've forgotten the title. I'll do it again. It's right in front of me and I've forgotten the title. This week, we are discussing 1929's Best Picture winner, The Broadway Melody.
Hey, and you know the drill. Before we begin, if you haven't already subscribed to Deep Dive Movie Reviews, just go ahead and hit that button, ding that bell so you never, ever miss a video. James, let's talk about The Broadway Melody.
Okay, so The Broadway Melody, produced in 1929, is the first sound film to win the Best Picture Oscar. It's also the first musical to win an Oscar. And many people cite The Broadway Melody as one of, if not the first musical to come out of Hollywood as well. Just to set up the story, The Broadway Melody tells the story of two sisters, played by Anita Page and Bessie Love, who come from out west to New York City in the hopes of transforming their vaudeville act into a Broadway hit. So, Steve, where to begin with this one?
You know, after last week's Wings, I had gone into this thinking, because I was so pleasantly surprised by Wings, thinking, oh, am I really going to enjoy, as I mentioned last week, a movie that's almost 100 years old, that's silent, and finding myself delightfully surprised at how much I enjoyed that film. I went in this week thinking I'm going to watch Broadway Melody and I'm going to have that same experience, and I just didn't. Right. I found this an underwhelming film. I try to not impart the social mores of today into a film 100 years ago and critique it because there's going to be sexism and racism and different elements that we would be uncomfortable today. I just want to judge the film within its time frame. That said, I'm thinking, is every guy in this film a touchy-feely perv? Like, this film offended my sensibilities at a certain level. I found it I found the musical numbers underwhelming. I found the acting very amateurish. And I felt like I was watching an amateur production of a stage play where the people are not necessarily bad actors, but they ham up areas that shouldn't be hammed up. They overplay areas that shouldn't be overplayed. Everything kind of misses the mark in different key elements. That combined with just the uncomfortableness I felt watching certain interactions between men and women in this film, I came away underwhelmed.
Yeah, no, I have to say I agree with you. I think that after the incredible sort of experience of watching Wings, that it kind of sort of set us up for a certain sort of threshold, a certain sort of high watermark. And it was kind of amazing. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the productions really don't have anything to do with each other. They are merely successive winners of the Best Picture Oscar. But it was amazing seeing that Wings was so sort of innovative, and it was a silent film that really pushed the boundaries of what a silent film could be. And you would have thought, oh, okay, well, as we move into the talkies, you're going to see a lot of that filmmaking technological kind of skill really be kind of sort of brought over into these early talkies. But it wasn't at all. This really felt like such a huge sort of step backwards in terms of just its technical ability and filmmaking ability. You know, this felt like a stage play. A lot of the acting felt very wooden.
Yes.
The main actress who plays Hank, Bessie Love, stumbles over her lines on a number of times. It's like, you could go again, right?
It's film costing a lot, and you don't want to, maybe there was a budget issue. I don't know.
Yeah, I read, on Wikipedia basically that they were really focused on obviously the sound technology. It was really cutting edge stuff. They were breaking new ground all the time, and that would actually eat up a lot of their budget because they would go back again and again and again and again to re-record the musical numbers and her playing a ukulele and all of these sequences. And you were like, if you're that willing to do so many takes for a story like this, can you not just give her another go at the line that she completely fumbles?
Exactly.
Here and there. So in that regard, it felt very sort of amateurish, very awkward, very sort of rough around the edges. I mean, and I've seen a lot of films from, you know, from this period of time, late 20s, early 30s, you know, the dawn of the talkies, if you like. And I understand that, you know, watching them with a 21st century perspective, it's going to feel like a very different experience. You know, a lot of the fade ins and fade outs lead a lot of the sequences to lack the kind of punch that would be used to. You know, there's a certain sort of editing punctuation that we're used to now, where one scene will sort of jump cut straight into the next scene as soon as that last line of dialogue has been uttered, or even with overlapping dialogue, just to help the kind of pace of the movie. Whereas invariably in films from this period, there are two things that really sort of slow it down. There's not much score in a lot of these early talkie films, and that really makes it all feel very kind of slow and stilted. And also, almost every film, they finish the dialogue, they finish the scene, and then it fades out, fades to black. There's a beat, and then the next scene fades out. So you've got like 5 seconds of kind of dead time in between every scene. And here it felt particularly obvious and jarring, and it really just sort of made the whole ordeal even more arduous.
Very, very much so. There was establishment shots that took way too long, or when they're trying to convey information, a business card being shown, rather than just flash, we grab the information, the camera would just rest on that for an inordinate amount of time. And you're just thinking, you know, and granted, we're living in the 21st century where social media and everything's multitasking, and this obviously is moving at a much slower pace. But having said that, after seeing, like you said, Wings, the first Best Picture winner, this seems like such a step down from Wings. And it's interesting, I was looking at the other films that were in contention for the Best Picture up against Broadway Melody. And although I haven't seen them, the synopsis just seems so much more interesting. There was The Patriot, about the Russian Tsar, there's a conspiracy to kill the Russian Tsar because he's become so demented. And then there's The Alibi, where a policeman's daughter actually starts dating a gang member, and he uses her as an alibi because he's doing the criminal activity. And these synopses sounded so much more rich and deep, as opposed to Broadway Melody, which is just, it comes across by the end of it, just, this is a very shallow movie with no nuance. The musical numbers are very amateurish. The dancing doesn't seem particular. Granted, some of those tap dance numbers were quite impressive, and I did enjoy that. But I found a number of the musical numbers just very underwhelming and boring. I found myself going, almost wanting to speed this up.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. It's sort of surprising in a way that the film was actually quite successful at the box office, and I think a lot of that was to do with kind of the novelty of it. You know, the talkies were still very much, you know, a novelty. People weren't sure if they were going to take off, if they were going to be, you know, as accomplished, as successful as silent movies had been. Obviously, a lot of stars struggled with the transition. A lot of filmmakers struggled with the transition as well. But I think the audiences came to see musical numbers, you know, that you could watch somebody sing and dance and play an instrument and tap dance and hear them do it at the same time. And I think that was kind of a novelty. And there was also a gimmick that they used, using a bit of two-strip Technicolor, that one of the big sort of show numbers in the middle of the film was where you could actually watch that in color. It doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, but it was something that they did at the time. Then, you know, they couldn't afford to do the whole film in color.
Now we know where that budget. We know where that budget issue went.
Right,
now.
so the budget kind of all went there. I mean, it's interesting what you said about the plot, because I think on paper it sounds kind of okay, actually. You know, you've got Eddie Keans, Charles King, this guy who works at a music sort of publishing place. He's a composer, and he's got a new song that he wants to get into this kind of variety show on Broadway. And he's got these two girls, one of whom he's engaged to, or has been.
I don't know if they were officially engaged, but they're definitely an item with.
They are betrothed. They're betrothed to one another.
They are meant to be. Yes.
Right. And he's like, I'll send for you, and brings them over to Broadway. And then the drama of the film is that he instantly falls for the younger daughter, who has bloomed in his absence.
Yes.
And then it's a cautionary tale about the horrors of of the Broadway lifestyle, you know, and of the arts. And I mean, I read it as a very sort of thinly veiled allegory to the horrors of Hollywood, you know, because there are all these stories about characters like coming to Broadway. But obviously at that time, you know, Hollywood was kind of booming, you know, it was in a transitional phase, but you know, it was already very much, you know, the city of dreams and all of this kind of stuff. And people were heading west, you know, to go and become a star, you know, because it was this very quickly expanding industry. And I read Broadway Melody as essentially this is kind of a satire on Hollywood.
Right. Oh, interesting.
But it's using Broadway because it would be it's more of an accessible platform, you know, for an audience. Because I imagine at that time, although audiences would be very aware of cinema, of course, and aware of the stars that they loved and all the rest of it, I don't think they would have a particularly sort of strong understanding of the machinations, the inner workings, the behind the scenes, particularly of the horrors. And so I read it as, okay, it's trying to tell a story about what's happening in Hollywood and the struggles faced by many an ingenue going out west to make a name for herself, and how she can be so easily exploited.
Well, you make a good point there, because if you're really trying to show what it looks like behind the scenes in a Hollywood setup, but using Broadway as the metaphor, you have even the costume designer, who's obviously a homosexual. He's obviously gay. And, you know, there's a couple scenes where he has an interaction, and you know that this is what they're alluding, that this is part of the environment in the movie making industry, even in 1929. And I'm realizing this is a pre-code movie. Right. And so obviously the Hays Code was put into effect in 1934. This is 1929. And so certain elements that would not have been entertained in another 5 years, we do see in this film. Obviously the allusion to the homosexuality, and the fact that Eddie's going to cheat on Hank and go off with Queenie, and that in the end, Hank is quite happy with this. And that would not have been allowed post 1934, because people often say with Casablanca, who is Ingrid Bergman going to end up with Humphrey Bogart or Paul Hengry? And if you understand the code system, you would know there's no way a movie would have been allowed to have where a married woman left her husband to have a, you know, passionate affair with another man. That would have just
with a bar owner in Morocco.
Yeah. So I mean, this film did have elements. Charles King's Eddie Kearns, I don't know about you, but he just seems a little slimy. Like if you're kind of with a woman and then her sister shows up and you're touching her and drawing her close, and oh, isn't she grown up? And, you know, and hey, isn't she become a sweet dame? And I'm just getting like this weird feeling watching this guy. This is the guy that you warn other people about.
Oh, sure. I mean, we're watching this film in a sort of a post Me Too era, and there are some serious rapey vibes from a number of these characters. I mean, obviously, Jack Warrener, Kenneth Thompson's character, who is the wealthy playboy suitor who wants to take Queenie off. I mean, he's just the most vile, reprehensible guy. It culminates with him sort of cornering. Well, he rents his apartment for her, and then corners her in there and refuses to let her go until she's essentially put out, because he's like, well, I've done enough. And I mean, I think the pre-code era is fascinating. We're going to have a number of these films. I'm not sure how many of them actually won Best Picture, but we're going to find out. But this is a great example of one of those films from the era where you're saying it's alluding to the fact that one of the characters is homosexual. I don't think it's even really alluding to it. I think it's showing it, as blatantly as one can in 1929.
Well, there's a scene where the costume designer comes up to Mr. Zanfield and says, oh, I couldn't get the gold, but I got it in the silver, and then Zanfield says, get it for me in the gold. And he's like, oh, it was so blatant. I actually found that very amusing. It was one of the parts of the film I actually enjoyed.
I thought it was fun, and I think it did a pretty good job of showing this world to be as incredibly sort of debauched and lewd and amoral as it is. And there's no doubt that it's because of films like this and yes, there are many examples, but this is definitely one of those films that helped the Hays Code come, or triggered the Hays Code to come into existence and go, no, we can't show this on screen. This is just, Hollywood was garnering this reputation for being sort of Sin City, essentially.
Right. And it still has that reputation too.
Sure,
I think still there. I think in the Wikipedia,
I think it's woke liberalism these days more than the debauchery. But certainly in the run up to like the Me Too era and whatever, you knew that a young woman going to go try and make a name for herself in Hollywood was going to face all kinds of Jacques Warriner types in and outside of the industry itself.
Well, if you look at Anita Page, who plays Queenie Mahoney, she says that Irving Thalberg had offered to put her into 3 different movies if she slept with him. And I mean, thinking this is a guy who we give an award to at every, there's an honorary award given out
named after him.
Yes. And I'm sure this guy was probably not much, better than a Harvey Weinstein. You could just imagine in that time period, what these women had to do in order to secure roles. And this is why I'm a fan of Me Too.
Well, sure. Absolutely. But I thought that was one of the elements of the film that worked for me. I thought it was interesting to see that essentially, much like Wings the year before, it's essentially a love triangle, but it's flipped. It's one guy and 2 women, whereas the previous one was 2 guys and 1 woman. But beyond that, I found that there was very little. It was just thin. I found that the plot didn't really go anywhere. It establishes almost immediately, here's the situation. The 2 sisters come out. He's promised to himself to one of them and then instantly falls for the other one, and that's the drama, and it doesn't, and nothing else really happens. And then they still sort of drag it out for 100 minutes.
Yes, this could have been, it wasn't a long film. I think it's about an hour and 45 minutes or something like that, and it still could have been 20 minutes shorter.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, or you just have a more detailed plot, a more comprehensive plot. As I said, nothing really happens. I mean, but then I think, as we've also said, people were coming to it for the music, for the dance numbers, and it doesn't help that those dance numbers, by today's standards, certainly are not especially strong, and they're not particularly catchy. You've got the Broadway Melody sort of theme song, if you like, which they play over and over and over again. But other than that, there's I can't really remember any of them, and I only watched it a couple of days ago.
There's that song "You Were Meant for Me," and that actually was subsequently used in other films and was quite popular at the time. But actually, I found the song largely forgettable. If anything, the one thing that kept going in my brain, it gets in there like a little worm, is Broadway Melody.
Yes, and that gets into. I mean, it's interesting for a moment where you see them kind of putting the song together at the beginning. And I was going with the movie for the first few minutes of it. I didn't write it off immediately. When Charles King's doing his first performance of it, in the office to everybody, I was like, okay, yeah, this is kind of cool. And then he does it again in the hotel room to the sisters, and I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, he's onto something. And then it just goes on and on and on and on and on, and I was like, okay.
Well, then he does it in the review, and then they tell him, oh, it's too long, cut it again, and then he does it again. And this is what you said though, and it really comes down to this: is the story is just the excuse to be able to have these song and dance routines.
I think
that people hadn't seen on the big screen before. It was a novelty. It's like having the old video games that I would have when I was a kid. It was amazing. We couldn't believe that we could, in our own living room, play these arcade games. And then you look back at those arcade games now compared to what we have, and they just, it doesn't hold up. And unfortunately, I think the Broadway Melody was a noble exercise for 1929. But
I mean, it's not so much the innovation itself as the accessibility, and so this was a way of making these sort of song and dance numbers by accomplished artists accessible to everybody wherever in the country you were. You didn't have to come to Broadway to see this kind of show. It was playing at the cinema near you, wherever you happen to be. And I think that's the appeal.
But you could imagine if you, especially if you were living in a rural area and you could never even dream about going to somewhere like New York or LA or one of these areas. In fact, the movie often alludes to the idea that the girls had the option, instead of starving and struggling in New York, they had guaranteed work at these little 30 stop, going from small town to small town. It wouldn't be as illustrious, it wouldn't be as famous, you wouldn't have your name in the big nights, but you'd be a star. And at one point at the end, when they actually decide to do that, or at least Hank does with a new partner, that they kind of say it's better to be a star. I think it's better to be a star in Oka.
I forget the line.
I'll just make up the town. It's better to be a star in Harrisonburg than to be starving in Broadway,
Yeah, and absolutely.
Kind of, yeah. So,
and I think it's interesting that Hank ends up, hitting the road for that reliable paycheck, for the road, for the steady gig, with the girl who was trying to sabotage them, at the very beginning, with that blonde girl, and with the with Uncle Jed. Yeah. And I think it's interesting how Uncle Jed is portrayed, because they give him a stutter, which essentially kind of emasculates him. And what it tells the audience is he's trustworthy. He's not going to be this predatory threat that Warner is, or he's not going to be an unreliable sort of love interest like Eddie is.
Yes.
He's the safe bet. Yeah. Go with Uncle Jed. And yes, you'll be hitting the road, you'll be staying at small places along the way, but it's steady work and you will be safe with him.
And that dealing with his stutter and watching him was much more enjoyable than watching Eddie going, "You're such a swell dame. I just love you, and you're swell.
Let me just touch you some more.
Can I touch you some more? Here, let me move you this way, and so I can rub your shoulders over here. It's I was just like, this guy."
Yeah, I the most frustrating character for me was Hank, Bessie Love, because when she was on her game, I thought she gave a really good performance, actually, when she remembered her lines and was actually sort of hitting her marks and whatever. She was actually really good. And I found the character really kind of interesting, because I think it was subverting a lot of the stereotypes that her sister so readily fulfilled. Right. But then they didn't do anything really with that. I was wondering almost whether there was supposed to be a suggestion that she was actually a lesbian. That even though, and that's why she was quite happy to sort of let her sister take Eddie, because it wasn't what she really wanted. But then the film doesn't do that, because she does quietly cry to herself that she's lost Eddie. But, so there were all of these little sort of suggestions that she could be a far more complex and interesting character. But then the film never quite sort of explored that. And I think overall, as we've alluded to, that's the problem with the film, is it takes a potentially promising premise and then sort of completely wastes it and just uses it as a vehicle for song and dance numbers. So yeah, Broadway Melody, for good or ill, did win Best Picture in 1930. The Academy was still very much kind of finding its feet, trying to work out exactly what the Oscars was going to be and what it wanted it to recommend. This one, the first one, as we said, all the winners knew ahead of time who had won and who hadn't. Apparently that wasn't the case for the second one, although no official nominees were announced ahead of time. So I'm not sure how they went about inviting people to the Ambassador Hotel, for the event, whether, and if you were invited, did that mean you were probably going to win an Oscar? I mean, obviously not. Sort of retroactively, lists did emerge of who was kind of in contention. So today, when you look down at, there were nominees for Best Picture. There were nominees in the other categories as well. So, for example, in the Best Actress category, Bessie Love was apparently nominated, even though, she wasn't officially, and she didn't win. Mary Pickford won for another movie. And I think the director was nominated as well. And he's an interesting character, Harry Beaumont. I think he's kind of in stark contrast to William Wellman. And because it was kind of interesting, because Wings last year, it was this hugely expensive, innovative movie, and they gave it to this youngster, this relatively unproven 29-year-old. Broadway Melodies, arguably, they were aiming for something as equally innovative. It was the first talkie, or one of the first talkies. It was the first musical. so they put it in the hands of a very sort of trustworthy guy, Harry Beaumont, who, although not very, very old, he was about 40. He'd done dozens and dozens and dozens of silent movies at this point. But then I don't think he managed to achieve anything particularly special. I mean, it won Best Picture and it made money at the box office. So you can say, well, what more do you want?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's certainly not a particularly sort of memorable one. But yeah, the only other thing I wanted to say is that these awards took place in April 1930. There would be another Oscars ceremony later this same year. The third Oscars would take place because although they didn't know ahead of time who was nominated here, the movies were all from the previous year. And I think the Academy wanted to kind of reposition that, recalibrate that a little bit. And so the next Oscars took place, I believe, in November the same year for the films of 1930. And we will get to that next time. So, Steve, wrapping up, do you think the Broadway Melody deserves its place in Oscar history?
James, I think it's no surprise, given what I've said over the last 20 minutes, that I would say no. James, coming off of Wings and the actors that were involved in that film, Richard Arlen, Charles Rogers, and even Gary Cooper, there was a measure of gravitas. The acting, I thought, even given it was 100 years ago, I could see that film in the films that I know and love today. I don't have that same feeling with Broadway Melody. I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to be innovative. For the first time, we've got a talkie and we've got some song and dance numbers. And it is, as we said, it was unique. And I'm sure people at the time appreciated it. It was new. But for those of us looking back, there's not much that is not forgettable here. It's a very forgettable film. And so I would say, unfortunately, the Broadway Melody does not stand the test of time and does not earn its place in history. I should say in Oscar history. I
think I agree with you completely. I mean, it's one of those stories that we've seen done again many times, way better. There were always going to be these kind of movies at the forefront of some new technological development where that's the priority for the studio, and so they don't want to pay for big stars to go in it or deal with their egos or anything like that. And so they work in the moment, and then later on you look back and be like, well, that was just kind of a gimmick, that was a novelty. And I think that's the case here. As we've said, it obviously did what it set out to do. It put bums on seats, and it won the Oscar for Best Picture. So in that regard, you're like, well, job done, I suppose. But 100 years on, when I know we keep saying it and it's kind of unfair to do so, but hot on the heels of Wings, a film like that, no, it pales into insignificance.
Yeah. Well, everybody, that wraps up our second in the series of Every Best Picture. Tell us what you think in the comments section below. Does the Broadway Melody stand the test of time? We've given our opinion. What's yours?
That's right. We would love to hear from you. If you are a fan of it in particular, come and sing its praises. Fight in its corner. I want to know what you think does work in that movie and why. But in the meantime, thanks very much for watching. Remember to subscribe, ding the bell. Check out some of our other videos. We've got new movies reviews. We've got old movies. We're going to be having a lot more of those as we go through this journey of Every Best Picture. But until then, thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.